Next, former Senator George McGovern recounts the life of President Abraham Lincoln. He talks about Lincoln's political career, focusing on his legislative decisions throughout the course of the Civil War. Senator McGovern was introduced by author and critic Gore Vidal.
It is with some joy I present to you Senator McGovern, wiser than Caesar, but stuck with a different set of cards. So he and I can sit here and look on your happy faces and consider that how different this was from 1972, when all things seemed possible, convincing me that all things are. So we must gather our forces and we know that socialism must never come to America.
Well, over the years, I've had the privilege of being introduced by many important people, but this is the first time that I can recall being introduced by a man who got a standing ovation just for walking into the Nixon Library. And I'm very grateful to Gore for that. I've long regarded him as our leading man of letters. Thanks to all of you for coming out on a weekday for this occasion. I've been on a book tour of California for the last few days. While we're said to be in a deep recession today, every place we've gone in promoting this book on Abraham Lincoln, we've had a sellout. So I'm very grateful for that. That includes the first night at Book Passage in Corte Madera, where we sold over 200 books. It includes Redondo Beach, where we had another sellout. It includes Chapman University, where we were this afternoon. I've discovered that this Lincoln McGovern ticket is very, very popular, but it wasn't till tonight when we added Richard Nixon and Gore Vidal that we had 700 people come out. So I'm very grateful for that, and thanks so much for coming out. This little book that I have written on Abraham Lincoln is part of the presidential series published by Times Books, a division of Henry Holt, in which they propose to have an author write on the presidencies of every president, beginning with George Washington. I was in a restaurant in New York City about 3 years ago, And a lifetime friend of mine, Arthur Schlesinger, spotted me, and I saw him working his way over to my table, and he said, "George, I want you to do me a favor. I'm the editor-in-chief of a series of books on the presidencies of all of our presidents. We're going to have a different author for each president, and I want you to do one of these books." I begged off on the grounds that I had just started working with former Senator Robert Dole on a project that I think is very important, which is aimed at convincing the United Nations, with the United States in the lead, to provide a good, nutritious school lunch every day for every hungry school child around the world. I have been interested in this problem of human hunger all of my public life. Many people associate me with my opposition to the war in Vietnam, and that was a major concern of mine for about 10 years. But the recurring issue that I've been involved in from the beginning was reducing the amount of hunger in the world. I have always enjoyed eating, but I was at a lovely restaurant in Los Angeles last night with my friend Patricia Kelly, who's here this evening and who has been in charge of my book promotion tour. And I just thought what a wonderful, delightful experience that was, to be in that lovely restaurant and have this delicious meal. But it also occurred to me that I would have enjoyed it even more if I knew that everybody else could have an experience like that at some time in their life. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen as matters now stand. So I gave Arthur that excuse for not doing this book. He said, "Now listen, George, you've been telling me for 30 years that Northwestern University, where you went, is better than Harvard, where I went. Now's the time to either put up or shut up." So anyway, after about an hour, I said, "Well, I will do one of those books if I can get Abraham Lincoln. I've always thought he was our greatest president, notwithstanding the fact that he's the founder of the Republican Party, which, by the way, was the party of my mother and father." It's interesting that Bob Dole and I have teamed up on this effort to feed hungry children. He grew up in a Democratic family, strong New Deal Democrats. I grew up in a strong Republican Party, and we both seem to have crossed our parents. But I spoke up for Lincoln, and Arthur said, "Well, the trouble with that is that we've already had a request for Lincoln, President Bill Clinton." And he said, "This may come as a surprise to you, but some people think that actually being elected president is more impressive than just running for it." Anyway, I said, "Well, if he changes his mind, let me know." A year went by, and I get a call about midnight. It's Arthur. And he said, "Guess what? Bill Clinton has just told us he can't do the Lincoln book." So that's why I'm here as the author of Abraham Lincoln. It's interesting about Lincoln. Gore once wrote a fascinating historical novel about Lincoln. I think it's one of the better things that Gore has written. But he will verify what I'm about to tell you, that over 6,000 books have been written about Lincoln, more than all the other presidents combined. I think one reason for that is that people admire the enormous handicaps that Lincoln had to overcome to achieve the status that historians have given him as our greatest president. One of those handicaps was the unbelievable limitation on his formal education, 1 year of education. But during that time, he learned to read and he learned to write, and he never stopped. Reading all of his life, and enlarging his wisdom, enlarging his insights into human beings and into human history. And he learned to write. There's a brilliant new book out called Lincoln's Sword. And Lincoln's Sword, in that author's book, is his capacity to write. I don't know whether Gore would agree with me on this, but I think he was the best writer ever to sit in the White House. He didn't have ghostwriters, but he studied literature, he studied history, he studied the King James Version of the Bible, he studied Shakespeare, and he became probably the greatest writer ever to serve in the White House. I think one of the reasons for Lincoln's fame are those great speeches and letters that he wrote. He's been gone now for a long time, but those speeches are still readily available to us. So that's one achievement that has always impressed me. Another great handicap that Lincoln had was what today we would call clinical depression. It's a widespread malady among our fellow citizens. We had a daughter who suffered from clinical depression from teenage on. She medicated it with alcohol. She was in great spells of despondency, and the one thing that would bring her out of it was a half a bottle of vodka, and she was then the life of the party. But it eventually took her life, as it does the lives of so many of our fellow citizens. But I learned something about depression during that period. It can sink you into spells of despondency that are indescribable. It can take your appetite. It can rob you of your zest for life. You go to bed at night hoping you might not wake up in the morning. Lincoln talked about suicide repeatedly in his life. He told one of his state senators in the legislature at Springfield, Illinois, that he had quit carrying a knife for fear he would slit his wrists or his throat someday. It's not clear what causes depression in any of us or in Lincoln, but there were various things that seemed to contribute to it. The death of Anne Rutledge, whom some historians say was his first real love. I don't know how they knew that, but in any event, that was the verdict. Sometimes it might be the bankruptcy of a business, and he went through that twice with small stores that he attempted to run, that each time bankrupted him. It might have been the loss of an election. I know a little bit about that. It's more fun to win than it is to lose. It might be bad weather. Doctors today say it's a chemical deficiency. It might have some hereditary aspects to it, but in any event, Lincoln had to grapple with that miserable affliction through much of his life. He was in his office one day during the Civil War, and this is another paradox in his life. He hated war, and then had to preside over 4 years of it. One day, when a group of women were waiting to see him, they heard him laughing in his office. There were 2 or 3 men there, and the guffaws were coming out into the reception area. So when the women got in, the chairperson said, "We're pleased to meet you, Mr. President, and we thank you for your time, but we are disturbed that you would be laughing in the midst of this terrible war that's killing young Americans, both North and South." Lincoln said, "Ma'am, I can appreciate your concern over that. I understand that, but if I could not occasionally laugh, my heart would break in this terrible scourge that is upon the land." And the women accepted that. But I think it's a great tribute to Lincoln that he had this miserable attack of despondency time after time without any medication of the kind that we have today. No Prozac, no Paxil, no lithium, no electric shock therapy. He took that illness on alone. So I believe Lincoln deserves to be considered as an admirable figure, not only because he overcame the limitation of education, but also because he took on this terrible monster of depression that afflicted him so much of his life. Lincoln thought that his greatest achievement was the Emancipation Proclamation. Respectfully, I would beg to disagree. The Emancipation Proclamation was a seminal declaration in our history and something of great importance, although it didn't free slaves anywhere except in the 11 states of the Confederacy, where Lincoln was really powerless to enforce it. But it was the beginning of the emancipation of the slaves, and in that sense it was important. But I think the most important achievement of Lincoln is that he preserved the Union. When we sing "My Country 'Tis of Thee," or the Star-Spangled Banner, or "God Bless America," we're manifesting our pride in the United States of America. And that's what Lincoln preserved, was the United States of America, which was a sizable achievement. He had the capacity, I think, of a clever, shrewd politician, but also he had the visionary capabilities of a statesman. And both of those things were essential in his makeup. You don't land in the White House without some knowledge of politics and the ability to work within the political process of this country. And yet, it's not really worth getting to the White House if you don't have more than political skills and political talents. Lincoln also had a vision for this country. He admired Jefferson's Declaration of Independence above all other documents. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Lincoln said one day that he never had a worthwhile political thought that did not derive from the Declaration of Independence. He wasn't perfect in the White House. During the pressures of the Civil War, he lifted the writ of habeas corpus, which is one of our most priceless legal guarantees in this country, the right to know why we're being arrested, why we're in jail, and to come before a magistrate to be told what the charges are and whether or not they're valid for holding us in prison. That's one of the things that I objected to about sending these young men that scooped off the streets of Baghdad down to the Guantanamo base in Cuba. They neither knew why they were being held, nor did they have any recommendation from a judge as to whether or not they should be held, and that's too bad. But we can't condemn that kind of behavior on the part of President Bush Jr. And then say it's okay for Lincoln to lift the writ of habeas corpus. It's not okay, and it's one failure on the part of his administration. Lincoln also closed down some of the newspapers that were excessively critical of his administration. I've often wished in politics I had that power, but we don't have that power. We don't have it. We have to stand up and take it when an editor tells us we're off base. And so that was another mistake on Lincoln's part. But by and large, he did so many things that strengthened this country and preserved this country that we have to see the whole picture. Some biographers have overlooked some of the important things that happened in the Lincoln administration that had nothing to do with the Civil War. The Homestead Act. That's one of the most important acts in American history because it established the pattern of family farming that became the cornerstone of agriculture in this country. 160 acres would go to any American who would live on that slice of the public lands and farm it for 5 years. At the end of the 5 years, the government gave you that land. And that was about the size of family farms in this country for 100 years. They've gotten bigger now, but one of the reasons American agriculture has been the envy of the world is that we've had these family farm size structures. As I say, they've gotten bigger now, but still, the principle of family farming continues. What is a family farm? It's one that's about the size that a family can operate without hiring large numbers of industrial workers. That came in the Lincoln administration in 1862, right in the heart of the Civil War. The Land Grant College Act, the Morrill Act, as it was more correctly known as, provided for the federal government to underwrite land-grant colleges in all of the states. So we have Penn State, we have Iowa State. In California, we have a agriculture and mechanical science university. They're of tremendous importance to the development of the United States. A third thing, they created the United States Department of Agriculture, again, right in the middle of the Civil War. And then, not to be outdone, they built the Transcontinental Railway during the Civil War, stretching from Omaha, Nebraska, all the way to Sacramento. Lincoln loved railways, and he became a very successful attorney for the railroads, but here was this great structure, the Transcontinental Railroad. If I had my way, we would once again today begin building the fastest, the cleanest, the safest, the most efficient railway network in the world. And so if you take those 4 actions that I've just mentioned, that's a pretty good record for any administration, and they shouldn't be forgotten. Well, these are just a few of my thoughts on Abraham Lincoln. We have this great Mount Rushmore monument out in South Dakota with the 4 faces carved on the side of the mountain. Washington on one end, Lincoln on the other, and Thomas Jefferson and Theodore Roosevelt in the midsection. It's a great inspiration to see it. I think Lincoln belongs on that monument as one of our great presidents. I'm going to take a few questions from the floor, and then after we do that, I will sign books, I hope for a long time. I want to explain to you that I don't keep any of the money I get for the books I've written. It isn't that I don't need the money, but I have some foundation work that I'm involved in, including a foundation on alcoholism, and that's where any of the royalties that I receive go. My books don't sell like Gore's do, and that's why he's a lot richer than I am. But I want to thank you, Gore, for being with us tonight. You honor us with your presence. Okay, I'll take your questions, and since I don't get to the Nixon Presidential Library too often, you can ask questions on anything you want to raise here. Somebody had a hand up over here. Okay, right there. Just stand up and speak loudly, and I think they'll. Maybe this. Oh, wait, here we are. Here's the microphone over here.
Senator, it's good to see you.
Thank you.
I saw Robert Kennedy in 1968 before he was shot. My question is, had he lived, would you have run with him for president or vice president?
Who was the person?
In other words, had Senator Robert Kennedy lived, would you have run with him in 68?
Well, if he had asked me, I certainly would. I certainly would have thought about it. Yeah, I think this Kennedy family is one of the most remarkable families in the history of American politics. That doesn't mean I think they were perfect. They certainly wouldn't claim that for themselves. But losing Ted Kennedy today, actually yesterday, again made me sad to reflect on these brothers in the Kennedy clan. Each one of them had certain talents. I think Ted was the best senator of the three, partly because the other two, Robert Kennedy and John Kennedy, had their eye on the White House. And Ted, at least after the tragedy at Chappaquiddick, had his eye on being the best senator he could possibly be, and I think he achieved it. He was a great senator, but with regard to your question, no one of the three ever asked me to run with him, but if they had, I would have thought about it. By the way, I don't claim to be the world's leading expert on how to pick a vice president.
You actually just answered my question partially. I was just wondering if from your time in the Senate, if you had any particular individual memories of Ted Kennedy, because it's such an odd irony that you're here today in this place. I mean, and that he just passed away yesterday, so I guess I couldn't resist asking what seems like a very overly obvious question, but is there any particular bill or time or anything, good or bad, or just interesting?
You know, one thing, I'll mention a couple of things that I admired about Ted Kennedy. Number one, after that tragedy at Chappaquiddick, I think many people would have just quit politics after that. Ted certainly didn't need the job. Any one of those Kennedy brothers could have been a full-time playboy if they had wanted to be, instead of working as hard as they did in public service. But I saw Ted in his office within 2 or 3 days of that Chappaquiddick tragedy, 7 o'clock in the morning. I saw him there at 7 o'clock at night, and that was his pattern, to get up and work as hard as he could. That's what he did for 47 years. He and I arrived in the Senate the same day, in 1962, and I sat in the back row of the Senate with Ted for a number of years. Freshman senators always started in the back row. He and I chose not to move up, even though seniority would have permitted it. I come from South Dakota, where Wild Bill Hickok got shot in the back, and so there's some advantage about being in the back row, where no one can get behind you. But Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin also stayed in the back room. I said to him one day, you know, Gaylord, the one problem with these seats back here is that it's sometimes hard to hear the discussion on the Senate floor. He says, that's what makes it the best seat in the House. Well, to be more serious about this, Ted was a great senator, and he hardly missed a day in his office. I think that takes a certain amount of guts to survive an embarrassing incident of that kind as he did, and yet keep working. The other thing I admired about him on a personal basis, if any senator had a loss, a child that got in trouble, a spouse that died, any other setback, he was the first person to call. When our daughter Terry died, it was a really tragic thing for Eleanor and me, and he was there at 9 o'clock the next morning with his wife to to express sympathy. He was a person, I suppose the repeated tragedies in his own family had something to do with that, but he was a very thoughtful person. I thought a lot of him as a human being.
Good evening, Senator. Thank you for your years of service and your scholarship. I look forward to reading your book, and thank you again for your dedication to truth and dignity and your humility. Mike? My question goes back to Abraham Lincoln. In his brief tenure in the House of Representatives, he stood up and criticized, condemned the war between the United States and the invasion of Mexico. How do you compare your own outcry against the war in Vietnam? How do you compare with the political cost that he suffered with yours?
Yes, well, there is a parallel there. Lincoln, as you say, had only one term in the House of Representatives. It's not entirely clear that he didn't go back to the House because of his opposition to the war in Mexico, but certainly that was a hazardous position to take. It's always hazardous to oppose a war once the bands begin to play and the flags wave, and to criticize a war in progress is dangerous politically. I knew that during all those days when I was opposed to the war in Vietnam. In fact, I thought I would not survive beyond one term. As it turned out, by the time I came up for re-election, most of my constituents were beginning to question the war, and so I survived, but it is a hazardous position to be in. I do wish that more senators and congressmen would take a look at our growing military involvement in Afghanistan. I think that's a really how shall I say it, an unwise military venture. I am for Barack Obama. Everybody knows I'm a Democrat, and I have a high regard. I think he's a talented, articulate, capable man, but I think he was wrong to come into the office and almost immediately send another 21,000 young Americans into Afghanistan. And you know from history that it'll only be a few months when the Joint Chiefs are asking for another 25, another 30,000. And I don't want to see us go down that slippery slope as we did in Vietnam and in Iraq, another ill-advised war that we never should have entered. There are many reasons why I wish we had a Lincoln speaking out against the war in Afghanistan. For one thing, we just can't afford these wars anymore. We're $14 trillion in debt right now, and a major part of that is from the war in Iraq and the subsequent war in Afghanistan. So even on a dollar and cents standpoint, we got to be a little more careful before we order American forces into these conflicted parts of the world like the Middle East. I think Genghis Khan was the first one to invade Afghanistan, but he was followed by the British and then more recently by the Russians. The Russians put 100,000 crack troops in there. 25,000 of them were killed dead on the battlefield. More than that number crippled or injured. The Russian treasury was drained to the breaking point, and after 11 years, they finally limped out of there defeated. And I fear that possible future for for us. So if I were in the Senate, I'd be raising lots of questions about why we are in Afghanistan. One question I'd like to ask: how do we know when we win? What have we got at the end of the war? So those are things that I think a lot about, and that it's one of the reasons I admire Lincoln. I don't know all the details of the war in Mexico. I'm not a specialist on that, but I admire his courage.
Hey, thanks for coming. I'm a history major, and I took a history of Vietnam class over the summer. And of course, your name was talked about a lot because it's the Vietnam era. And I was kind of disappointed because I got a 98% in the class, but it's all by memory. I'm really hardcore into the Vietnam era. And I was wondering if you had won, if you had won in 1972,
Yeah.
and what would you have done as president? I mean, we always hear about the campaign stuff, but you know, so many years down the line, I mean, looking back, now knowing what you know now and everything, what would you have done as elected in regards to Vietnam, Russia, the economy, everything like that?
Well, thinking about all those headaches is one reason I'm probably glad I didn't win. But to be more serious about it, this is what I would like to think I would have done. It's what I had in my mind. Some years ago, Gorbachev, the Soviet leader, met with Mrs. Thatcher in England, and she was very impressed with him. And she called her friend President Reagan and said, "This is a guy we ought to talk to. He's a serious man." And to his credit, President Reagan agreed to do that. Also, to his credit, when Gorbachev proposed that the time had come to end the Cold War, to stop the arms race, and to negotiate lower levels of military spending, President Reagan agreed. And I think that's one of the most important things he did, because for all practical purposes, that meeting between President Reagan and President Gorbachev ended the Cold War. And so today, we don't really worry today about the Soviets maybe clobbering us with a nuclear attack. The Cold War is largely over. To his credit, President Nixon opened the door to Communist China. I think that was the greatest achievement of his years in office. Today, nobody thinks China is going to attack the United States. They may worry a little bit about Chinese merchandise crowding out ours, but we get along reasonably well with China and with Russia, and you have to give credit to President Reagan and President Nixon that we no longer have the Sino-Soviet bloc. We no longer go to bed at night wondering if we might be eliminated during the night. I would have pressed on that front very hard. I would have tried to get to know the Soviet leaders and the Chinese leaders, and I would have pressed for even larger reductions, mutual reductions on both sides in the arms race that's been going on ever since the Second World War. I want to be clear on this. I believe in an adequate national defense. I was a bomber pilot in World War II, and after I signed up for pilot training, there was a year passed before they could take me because they didn't have any planes. They didn't have any instructors. I don't want us to see us get into that situation again, but neither do I want to see what President Eisenhower warned us against, the mounting power of the military-industrial complex take over the federal budget. And if I can digress here a little bit from Abraham Lincoln, today, as we meet here tonight, we have a military budget of $650 billion, 2/3 of $1 trillion. Do you know how much money that is? It's more than all the other countries in the world spend on military activities or military equipment. We got 185 countries in the world at last count, and 184 of them spend on military purposes less than the one country, the United States, does. Now, we have to be strong in a dangerous world. We don't have to waste money on weapon systems that are now becoming obsolete. I would have tried, even as early as 1972, and I proposed this during the campaign, that we undertake carefully developed reductions in military outlays and divert the savings into other sources of national strength, health care, education. So that's one of the big changes I would have tried to put into effect. You know, there's a lot of good ideas I'd like to see implemented, that other people would like to see implemented, but when you spend as much money as we do on the military, it really tightens up on what you can do in other areas. I think we need a new definition of national defense under which the quality of our education and the quality of our health care, the cleanliness of our environment, those things would also be included as national defense. What do you think? One more question? Okay, we'll take one more question, and then we're going to start selling books here. So I have to tell you, because there's so many people here, we better just take time to autograph books. I can't write in all the wonderful things you've done in public life. So if you'll be satisfied just with a George McGovern, we'll start that in a few minutes here. Thank you so much. Let's have one more question.
Just two questions, one old and one new. They're very short. With respect to Watergate, is there anything that you always wanted to bring up but never had a chance to publicize or bring out?
What was that question? Did you get that question?
I'm not sure what it is, but you should ask one question.
Yeah. Would you repeat your question?
I said, is there anything about Watergate that you always wanted to bring out that never became public or public enough?
Is there anything about Watergate that you'd like to bring out that hasn't come out?
Yeah. The question was, is there anything about Watergate that I would like to bring out that hasn't yet been brought out? No, I don't think so. I think I thought they did a pretty good job in investigating Watergate. Well, thanks ever so much, and where do I sign?
Thank you, Senator McGovern. Senator McGovern will be signing books back there. Please sign up for our email list if you haven't already. We'll have some wonderful events in the fall. Thank you very much for coming to the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum. Good night.
This book is part of Times Books' American President Series. For more information, visit AmericanPresidentSeries.com.